This is a production of Cornell University.
Back to Cornell.
All right, thanks very much, Bill. And if we were in Texas, here would be my official greeting. Howdy. Howdy. There you go. At Texas A&M, if we do anything twice, it's a new tradition. All right, so it's just the way we do things. And if it works to beat Alabama in football, we'll do it, right? Whatever it takes. But I do appreciate the invitation to come back to Ithaca. It has been almost a decade since I was last here. There's a lot of new things that I've seen on campus. The new bioswale along the road here is new. And there's a few trees I didn't remember being quite that big. So it was interesting to see the changing flora when coming back to Ithaca. This is a unique place, just like Texas A&M is unique in its own right. This is a unique within academia. This is a unique institution from its diversity of flora and fauna and from the diversity inclusion, which you guys have been embracing for decades, long before the nation found it cool to talk about diversity and inclusion. So I appreciate the opportunity to come and speak, and let's get started. The title for this presentation actually came to me in the shower, as most of my good ideas come. And I was in the shower and said, wow, that would be a great title. I got to remember the right opportunity to use that. So searching for the end of uncertainty. Now, right away, I'm going to steal my own thunder and say that this holy grail of uncertainty is something that we shouldn't even pursue, because it's not necessarily even possible to get into a situation with full degree of certainty. So the search for the end of uncertainty is not really the question. What is the question is, how soon will we get back to some degree of normalcy? Well, the short answer is, forget that, Joe. It ain't happening. We're not going to go back to the way in which we engaged before. Now, some might lament the fact that this is happening. However, from an economic point of view, there are actually some opportunities that are going to arise out of the pandemic that we would not have had otherwise. And indeed, we saw many different changes during the pandemic. The e-commerce sector, for example, grew in 1 year the equivalent to 5 to 7 years of growth in 1 year because of the pandemic. The way in which we learn has changed, and we simply won't go back to 100% in person. Even at conferences in the nursery and floral industry, we're going to see a hybrid of educational opportunities for members to engage in. So it just makes sense that we use the technologies and the skill sets that we have developed during the pandemic for other educational and industry applications. All right, so let me talk about what was happening in the green industry. I'm going to focus my comments on the green industry, but certainly whether it be the viticulture industry, whether it be the vegetable industry, there are other applications. There are certainly applications, what I'm talking about, to those industries as well. Then I'll talk about how COVID affected the industry in 20 and 21. And then what does a post-COVID green industry look like, which is, again, applicable to non-green industries. So before COVID, we were 128 months into the longest expansionary time period that our country has ever seen. All through the Obama years and the Trump years, our economy grew at an average between 2 and 2.25%, right? And the rhetoric politically is always, elect me so we can gain 3 or 4% on our economy. And that's simply not going to happen. We have a $22 trillion economy, and it takes a lot of economic growth to grow at 3, 4, or 5%. Now, we're going to be more than that this year. However, it took a pandemic, a collapse, for us to grow at that rate in the aftermath. Holding all of the things constant, we've been growing at 2%. We were at 128 months, extending the new record up until the pandemic. Housing was peaking, or so we thought. It is still in the midst of peaking. We couldn't even spell the word inflation We didn't know what inflation was. There are students that have grown up in this time period for the last decade who didn't know what inflationary pressures were, right? So that's certainly changed. Consumption was steady, but consumption is always steady. We as a consumer, we spend, our spending represents about 70% of GDP. So we do our job as consumers. We're going to spend our dollars, right? Particularly the baby boomers, all the baby boomers in the house. Let's move it up, right? Because we can't even spell the word inheritance, right? We're going to spend all of our kids' inheritance. So all you kids of boomers, you're out of luck. We're spending your inheritance. Consumption steady. Job growth was slowing, but it was still growing. And of course, the stock market was fairly steady. Again, a fairly even increase in the stock market all through the Obama years and the Trump years. And so there's not really a Trump bump as you hear in many instances. It's really constant. So I, as an economist, I'm quite frankly, I worry less about who's in the White House. I worry more about who's the chair of the Federal Reserve than I do who's in the White House. All right, so you see this particular supply chain diagram. I thought I would jokingly, I thought I would just come in with this one slide and then just speak from that one slide, which I have done in class before, right? But I want to mix it up a little bit. So it's the three numbers I want to call out to you, right? You got the allied trade sector, manufacturers down there at the bottom. You got the growers in the circle there. And I see some folks taking pictures. By all means, go ahead. But you're an email away from getting this PowerPoint, right? If you want this PowerPoint, I'll send you the PowerPoint. I won't send you a PDF. You can use the PowerPoint, right? I'll send it to you. It'll be yours for free. It's out of date tomorrow anyway. Because economic times change rapidly, right? That's why I have job security. So the growers are in the middle. On the right-hand side, you got the landscape service sector. On the left-hand side, you got the retail sector, and then the almighty consumer at the top. So that's the green industry supply chain. That negative 16% means that there's 16% fewer growers in the green industry today than there were prior to the Great Recession back in 2007. So we've lost 16% of our growers. Not all of that productive capacity left the industry. Some of it's under a different name, right? Like Color Spot was bought out by Altman Plants, for example. So on the retail side, we're down 5%. There was some consolidation, but there were some retailers that just went out, particularly independent lawn and garden retailers, garden centers. But you got on the landscape side, plus 17%. Are you freaking kidding me? 17%. Unbelievable growth, right? It's tied to housing. As I said, housing has been peaking. Every new house that's built, you got to have flower shrubs and trees around it. So we see that increase in landscaping services. Plus, landscaping is an easy entry, easy exit type of sector. Have truck, shovel, wheelbarrow, will landscape, right? So it's less capital investment, less labor investment to get into the landscape business. So you would anticipate that landscape services would increase. Pre-COVID, I'm still talking pre-COVID, so this is consumption of flowers, seeds, and potted plants up until 2020, right? So 2019 is the end year there. And if you follow the trend line, if you look at the cursor and the trend line here, that's a fairly consistent growth, but you saw the decrease in the Great Recession, and then it took us to about 2016 to get back to where we were prior to the Great Recession, and then we've grown from there. Now that's everything up pre-COVID. Enter coronavirus or COVID-19, right? Supply chain breaks. I thought this was a rather innovative graphic. I borrowed this from somebody online. I have no idea who it was because it wasn't an attribution. I generally try to provide an attribution, but that's a neat graphic. It's a supply chain represented by that chain, and you see the coronavirus molecule imprinted on the world. And indeed, in agriculture, horticulture specifically, we had spent 4 decades perfecting a globalized supply chain with just-in-time aspects all up and down the supply chain. 4 decades we've been perfecting this. We've had various free trade agreements that lent to that particular development of a globalized economy. And because of this, when you throw in a global pandemic, and then the rate of vaccinations across the United States has been mixed, but then you exacerbate that by looking at the entire world. And indeed, there's some countries where the average vaccination rate right now is still in single digits. So it's a dire situation still in some countries. So this is part of the dilemma is we haven't been able to get the inputs. We have my neighbor's renovating his house. It's still shingleless. It looks hideous. No shingles, but he can't get the shingles. And he can't get the windows. So builders are hurting for supplies. Green industry firms, vegetable, viticulture, you name it. Any sector within agriculture and horticulture is finding difficulty in getting inputs, and they're more costly. Now, right here, I've got a supply chain diagram, a pressure gauge, if you will. You don't have to look at the numbers. Economists are going to have numbers all over the place, but don't pay attention to the numbers. Look at the colors. Starting on the left-hand side, you got 5 different attributes of the supply chain. All these are economic variables. What first is related to time. How quickly are products moving through the supply chain? And you can see that in the early stages of the pandemic, we're on red alert. We can't even buy toilet paper, cleaning supplies, right? So we're on red alert, immediate disruption in the supply chain. And then you can see that other dimensions like volume, it's similarly impacted as red. The price impacts were not very huge at first. You still see a lot of green. The inventories, the next set of variables, we still had a fair amount of inventory except for some of those essentials, which is a word even today still makes me mad, because if anything was essential, it was flowers, shrubs, and trees during this time period to enhance the health and well-being of people that are going through a health crisis, that are under considerable pressures at home and otherwise, and managing, juggling all the plates and so forth, a lot of mental stress and so forth. We were part of the answer. And yet there were governors across this country that said, nobody's essential, including you all. So a lot of misperception, a lot of misunderstanding, and a lot of lack of knowledge, a lot of ignorance about the value of flowers, shrubs, trees, and people's lives, and the enhanced landscapes that we provide that are so beneficial. But that's a different talk. I got a whole lecture on that as well, but that's a different talk. The labor aspect is the bottom set of attributes. And of course, manufacturers and distributors in the supply chain have had the same conundrum in terms of finding labor as we have within the green industry. There were certain sectors like trucking that's very difficult to find truck drivers. We're 80,000 drivers short, projected to be 100,000 drivers short by 2023. During the pandemic, truck driving schools closed. Much of the cargo in our industry has to be delivered in pairs or teams. It's harder to pair teams in the trucking industry when you got folks that are vaccinated, some that aren't, so forth. And so we've seen higher freight rates as a result of the higher pay for drivers, the higher prices of diesel, the higher prices of just carrying cargo. We can't find containers, can't find trailers, and the containers that we do have went from like $600, 6,000 was the World Container Index. 40-foot box containers on a shipping container went from $6,000 pre-pandemic to $30,000 today. Right, so there's a lot of expenses. You see the now hiring sign on the side of that truck, back of the truck there. Almost every business in our industry, they have a now hiring sign. This is the great resignation or the great reevaluation been called this in the media, where a number of people, 10 million to be exact, 10.5 million just 3 months ago, elected not to go back to work during the midst of this COVID crisis, which still is not at its end. That's down to about 7 million workers that have elected still not to go back to work. Now, why is that? Well, the right-hand bar here, the red portion of the bar on the right-hand side, so that's about 31% of those surveyed said they're not going back to work at the same pay and the same hours as what they did before. When you ask them why, it was either too long a commute, they didn't like the job that they were doing, and particularly in the service sector, those that have to interact with these less than mature, non-intellectual folks who were unvaccinated. Did I say that? Okay. Having to deal with folks in the general public in a service setting, they said, no, thank you. I don't want to do that. I've been wanting to start my own company for a while, so I'm going to start my own company. We've seen a record amount of entrepreneurialism in the midst of the pandemic. So it's kind of offsetting the number of businesses that have left. We see a record number of businesses that are established. Inflation, now we can spell inflation. We're even talking about terms like stagflation, which we're not heading into yet, by the way. There's two different indicators, the CPI, which you normally hear within the media. They talked about the consumer price index, and I prefer looking at the personal consumption expenditures index because this is the one that the Federal Reserve uses to decide on whether it's going to raise interest rates. And that green line, that 2% target, has traditionally been the line at which if inflation crosses that, the Federal Reserve starts raising interest rates to curb inflation, put a damper on the economy. But you can see it's almost twice the target now. The Federal Reserve has maintained that they're not going to raise interest rates until at least this time next year and 3 times in 2023. But I'll get to that here in a second. Now they have a range in which they're going to be patient and they're not going to increase interest rates past that range. They haven't told us what that is yet, but there's more patience being exercised. This is a different dashboard. This is a consumer dashboard, much like the other one on the supply chain, except you have consumer metrics. And look, you can see the red when the pandemic started. And we finally realized, January and February, we weren't thinking much about it because we weren't told much about it. And that we were told, our leadership was poo-pooing. So we weren't told that much, but by the time March and April got here and things got really busy, then you can see the consumers and all those metrics on the red on the left. And we got to March this year, and you can see things were getting better. But what happened in March? Delta. All right, so you had the Delta variant. And I've always said that the slope or the shape of the economic recovery is inversely correlated with the shape of the COVID curve. And you can see that it'll match. When we have these waves, we see the decrease in economic performance. Now, how did it affect the green industry specifically? Well, let's add the other bar here on the right. Let's add 2020, right? 2020, you can see actually increased. Say, well, that's pretty good. Well, okay, it is. But in every economic downturn, except for the Great Recession, that one is the exception to the rule, but in every previous economic downturn, during that economic downturn, we would have the staycation effect. People staying at home and gardening more, landscaping more, so we'd see more lawn and garden products being sold, right? Every recession. And then when people started making the switch to buying more durable goods, more cars, refrigerators, furniture, windows, and whatever, that's when our industry took it on the chin. And so you could look, for example, back in 2002 and 2003, right here. You see, we see the slight increase, And then when the recovery started for the rest of the country, that's when the sales went down in that first part of the year, and then it climbs after, right? So we always have that effect. This time, however, I put it on a monthly basis, and there's no correlate, the colors don't mean anything. I'm just separating years. From 16, you can see 17, see the growth in 18, 19, and 20. But here's the new trend line, the dotted line. And here's the first 6 months of 2021 up through June, because that's where all the data has been corrected and everything. These are the finalized data. And you can see that every month in 2021 was higher than 2020. So we're above trend. So when folks were asking me last year, Charlie, how much do you anticipate lawn and garden activity increasing in 2021? Will we see another 20, 25 increase like we saw in 2020 over 2019? I said I would be cautious in assuming that. I would be doing you a disservice as an economist. So take the last 3 years and average it, and then base 5 or 10% over that. That would be a conservative approach to estimating the market for 2021. But Bill, it turned out it was actually a pretty good year. All right. Now, I'm getting the same question now for 2022, to which my answer would be the same. I'd take the last 3 years, I'd average it. If you feel aggressive, go find another 5, 10%. On the grower side, COVID impacted our labor availability. You can see the bullets there. I'm not going to read the bullets. That would be death by PowerPoint. Instead, it affected our ability to find labor, just like every other sector in America. It affected our inputs. The cost of our inputs went up. It affected the number of plants that were sold online. We've seen some rather aggressive growth in the online provision of plants since the pandemic, right? And obviously freight and everything else is much more expensive, because I calculate an index of prices paid by growers. Again, a lot of numbers, don't pay attention to that. Look at the red box, and specifically down here. I have all the inputs that are used by growers: containers, fertilizer, media, the propagation materials, right? The labor, fuel, energy, trucking, and I have them weighted by their relative importance in the cost of goods sold. Well, how do I know that? That comes back from the benchmarking effort that you're referring to, Bill. That's where I collect that data. So I have these weighted by their importance. So even though containers have gone up 28% just by themselves, they only represent 10.24% of cost of goods. So it doesn't have that much. It has an influence, but not much of an influence in terms of cost. Our ability to grow inventory, however, it has a major influence. So relative to 2007, which is my base year, right before the Great Recession, all of these inputs are 41.5% more expensive today than they were prior to the Great Recession. Labor itself, look at this number, 150.8. That means that labor is 51% more expensive today than it was prior to the Great Recession. But there's two sides of that labor picture. There's the business side of having to pay those labor costs. There's the laborer side of trying to make a livable wage. And quite frankly, agriculture's been behind in terms of creating that livable wage, right? So there's an element here that's going to be both beneficial to businesses and laborers. And we're seeing some of the power base shift there more on the labor side. But in terms of year over year increases, look at this, Neil, almost 8% was what I was forecasting for 2021. That these weighted averages, all these inputs are going to be 8% more expensive in 2021 than they were in 2020. For my forecast in 2022, this was my latest revision back at Cultivate. I delivered this at Monday morning at the State of the Industry at Cultivate. Since then, I just did it before I came up here, it's 5.5%. So you got 8% increase plus 5.5%. My math, that's about 13.5%. So it's between 13, 14%. That tells me that growers should be raising prices by 13 to 14% simply because the cost of inputs is increasing. If they don't, what happens? Their margin, their profit margin is getting squeezed, right? So if you want to keep up with the increasing cost of inputs, you raise your price. At what point will we start impacting the inelasticity of demand by the consumer? Well, obviously, we saw higher sales in 2021 than we did in 2020, so we haven't gotten there yet. We will, but we haven't gotten there yet. On the retail side, same thing. I have a number of bullets. I'll be happy to send you my PowerPoint. You want to read all these in person, but they had labor, difficulty finding labor, difficulty finding plants. Some have even come up with the moniker of plant-demic instead of pandemic, the plant-demic, the shortage of plants. We had, the reason I know this is because I collect data on shrink at the grower level, and growers had record lows in terms of the shrink that the scrap or the stuff they threw away or they dumped. They had record lows in terms of their shrink last year. Why is that? Because retailers were calling last year and up until June this year, send me more product. Well, I don't have any more product. I've sold it. I got some that's smaller, it's out of spec. Send it on, right? I need plants. So growers didn't have to throw away as many plants as what they typically do. So shrink has been way down. Now, obviously, we have about 18.3 million new customers. Two different sources kind of validated this. There's an Axiom marketing study last year and this year that was released, and the National Gardening Survey. Both of them showed 18 million new consumers. The magic question is how many of those are going to stay customers in the lawn garden sector? I can't answer that question, right? If history is prologue, the consumption goes back to trend after the recession is over, right? So this isn't a man-made recession. This is a pandemic-caused recession, but it's still recession. 2 months, albeit, but we're still seeing the supply chain dimensions, the inflationary pressures that are reminiscent of recessionary times. So let's look post-COVID. Let's turn our attention all the way. I said that the shape of the economic recovery curve is inversely correlated with the COVID curve. And you can match this out, right? We've seen this fourth wave come upon us of the Delta variant. And now finally the 4-week moving average is going down. Hopefully it'll continue going down, but we'll see. Last April for a talk, I drew this graph in PowerPoint and I was showing that I'm expecting in the second quarter of 2020 that we're going to see a big decline, which we have. And I said, we'll bounce back in the third quarter, but we're not going to get back to normal, right? So, and we did. And there you see, I said the slope of the recovery from here depends on how well we get the health crisis under control. It depends on the pent-up demand, how many businesses go out of business, and then the policy dimensions that were put in place, like the CARES Act, PPP, the Payroll Protection Program, which ended up being very significant for the horticulture industry and provided some cash flow that we needed desperately. And in fact, many growers and retailers and landscapers came into 2021 in the best working capital position I've ever seen in my entire life, both growing up in the industry and in academia. I've never seen the working capital we've seen in this industry. Was my projection correct? Yep, so far, right? We saw the decline, we saw the bounce, we've seen this general price increase. So the question is, how does that going to look in the future? And the best gauge that I have is what's called the leading economic index. The leading economic index, which is a foretelling of how the economy is going to look 11, 12 months down the road. And you can see in the last 12 months during the pandemic, this insert right here at the bottom, this is pretty much, if history is prologue again, we can expect this kind of growth over the course of the next 11 months. Now, the Federal Reserve typically agrees with that. In their September meeting of the Federal Open Market Committee, they said they expect this inflation, which they have been referring to as transitory, to go down. Look, it's going to be 4.2% for this year, but they expect it to go down to 2.2% in 2022 and stay roughly at that level. That's why you have not seen an interest rate increase come from the Federal Reserve. I think that's fairly optimistic for the Federal Reserve. I think it will go down myself, but I don't know if it'll go down to 2.2. That's for the year, mind you. Now, core inflation is that same estimate, that same headline estimate. You back out energy and food, because those are the things within a household budget that fluctuate the most. So if you don't eat or drive, you're doing pretty good. But backing that out, it's about 3.7 and then 2.3 and 2.2. And those are just rounding estimates right there. Why the difference? But here's why this slide is important. Have a good class, Don. He told me he's getting ready to go teach class. So the federal funds rate, 0.1, 0.3, and 1.0. That means that in September, they said that we anticipate that we will increase interest rates by about 25 basis points next year, but probably not until the second half of the year. In 2023, which is the original year they said they'd raise interest rates, we'll have about 3 25 basis point increases. That's what they're expecting right now, the way the economy is performing. That's still really cheap money. 25 basis points is basically 0.25 of a percentage point. And we're just barely above zero now. So there's still very cheap money available. Now, the anticipated growth of the economy, GDP from here on out, is right here. This slower growth. See, 6.3% this year, 3.5% next year, which is still phenomenal growth. So that's why I'm very bullish on the lawn and garden sector, even going into next year. But then we're going to come back to trend, even a little bit below trend, because you can't grow at this level here and then expect just to go back to trend. You're going to have some lower than trend growth rates. Remember, this is growth, year over year growth. So it's going to slow down a little bit. Now, housing. Why has housing done so well? Well, millennials are the oldest millennials, 41 years of age. So they're buying houses, right? If they can find a house to buy, because the inventory levels have gone down to 2 months worth of supply. Now it's back up to 6 months, with about where it should be. Plus, folks said, if I'm gonna have to stay home during the pandemic, I'm either going to spruce this place up, which you saw home improvement sales really increase, or I might as well be at the beach. So I'm going to be zooming in to the office. It doesn't matter where I live. So a lot of that demand, and of course, mortgage rates are redonkulous. That's the technical economic term. They're redonkulous. It's just so low. New home sales and existing home sales, there is a difference. I won't go into defining that, but they've been stellar. This is the month's worth of supply, which was down, like I said, less than 2 months. Now it's back up here to 6 months. We're gradually building inventory. You can see that the number of housing starts projected is really increasing, not to where we were prior to the Great Recession, but it's around 1.5 million starts per year, which is where we would expect to be with the demographics we have in the country. Now, on the left-hand side, look at home prices. The blue line is the entire country, and the green line is the top 20 cities. The red line is the top 10 cities. The blue line there, this is where housing prices are now with the Case-Shiller index, right? This is where they are. Look at where they were prior to the Great Recession. Look how much higher they are now than they were back in the Great Recession right here. What caused the Great Recession? A housing bubble burst in the midst of a financial crisis. And we see housing prices here versus where they were when it burst and caused the Great Recession. I got my eye on this one. I'm not raising the flag and caution flag just yet, because the financial sector, because of Dodd-Frank, is in much better cash position today than it was prior to 2007, when Lehman Brothers basically brought the house of cards down. There's none of that occurring in the financial sector now. So it's much more robust and much more solvent than it was back then. That is a big difference between now and then. That's why I don't worry about the appreciation. Will we see a housing market correction? Absolutely. Any economist worth his or her salt will tell you there's a correction coming. When? Well, that's a good question. What does the post-COVID green industry look like? Again, I anticipate that pent-up demand to continue on, right? But it's going to be highly dependent on Delta. I expect there's going to be more business closures and more acquisition activity. I know that because the number of calls I get from venture capitalists that are wanting to spread that black powder around the industry, I get a lot of those calls when venture capitalists are looking to invest, because they hear Charlie Hall from American Hort or whatever, they want to have 30 minutes of my time just to talk about the industry. I tell them, sorry, I don't ever talk to a venture capitalist. You can do your own homework. I'm not, because we've not had that much good black powder come into the industry, and it helped us. It's always hurt us for the most part. So more constrained supply chains. Again, I said it's going to be this time next year before supply chains start improving. And we're going to see a de-risking in the supply chain. Folks are going to try to move production from internationally back domestically, regional or locally if they can. They're going to try to de-risk the supply chain all the way from computer chips to containers to everything. It's going to come at a cost, and it's going to take a while to get there. You just can't build a container manufacturing plant overnight, right? So it takes a while. So we're going to see some of that, the supply chain disruption continue. Once we get the kinks figured out, we will see the bullwhip effect. And that's an economic term where manufacturers and growers alike and so forth, it's like cracking a whip. When you crack a whip, if you're Indiana Jones, you see the big increase. And then as the whip goes out further, it goes right through the supply chain, right? It's kind of the, people sometimes refer to it as the pig and the python, right? You got this big flood of inventory moving through. Same kind of effect, though. We will see that inventory build, and then it'll move through the supply chain until it normalizes. So we're going to see a surplus of the plant demic right now will be turned into a plant surplus. How do I know this? I'm 59 years of age, and I've seen it every single time that we've seen in the industry where we've had a strong demand and a shortage of supply, and we're finally able to raise prices. I've seen the industry respond by planting the back 40 and the increasing inventories, and I know it's going to happen again. The only thing stopping it right now is the growers can't get the inputs to put in the inventory. They can't even build greenhouses because the greenhouse manufacturers can't get the steel and aluminum. Why? Because of the steel and aluminum tariffs. Right? So there's a lot of moving parts here that just can't be solved by just increasing consumer demand. There's just a lot of things that have got to happen sequentially, and it's going to take a while to sort that out. It doesn't happen overnight. Freight rates, I'm sorry, but they're going to remain high. Tonnage is expected to increase, and you have the supply chain disruptions and the driver shortages that I talked about. There will be more vertical coordination. What I mean by that, in economics, you have a vertical coordination continuum from open market exchange to dealing on contracts, to dealing in a strategic alliance, to working in a joint venture together. Both entities put together equity funds into a joint venture, to total vertical integration. I'm not talking about integration. I'm talking about more closely aligned relationships between players in the industry, either through a strategic alliance or use of contracts. I think we'll see more of that. There's going to be short-term constriction in the customer palette. Well, why? Because garden centers are focusing on the plants that they know best. I don't know this to be true, Bill and Neil, but I'm suspecting that there may be fewer new plant introductions in the short run because of it. You know, we didn't have a lot of the breeding and so forth. It was constricted because of the pandemic. We may actually see fewer new plant. I got a question mark there, but I'm supposing that may be the case. E-commerce is going to continue to ramp up. I know growers within my Eagle Executive Education Program building up e-commerce applications and their capabilities to provide plants by e-commerce using artificial intelligence, big data analytics, etc. There's going to be more innovation on the sustainable side. If I can't get the plastic containers, I'll try these alternative containers, right? And we're seeing that in terms of the demand. Logistics innovations, warehouse automation, so forth. Rising input costs, as I mentioned earlier, it's going to continue. But shrink, labor, and working capital are still the trifecta in terms of being profitable. Almost finished here. There's higher operating costs of being safe, providing a safe environment for our worker and customers. Surpluses, I said, are inevitable. And then numerous marketing efforts are underway. That's a good thing because we need to be shouting the benefits of flowers, shrubs, and trees at the top of our voice. And then at the same time, though, there's the one question. It's like in the movie City Slickers, when Billy Crystal asked the curler Curly what the secret of life was, he said one thing. Well, and Jack Palance, who played Curly, he died before he told him the one thing. So I'm getting ready to tell you one thing, and I got to say it in a hurry so I don't die before I tell you. But the one thing that I can't answer is what the consumer's going to do. I don't know what the shape of this curve looks like right now. I suspect it will go back towards trend. I don't know if we'll remain at this high elevated demand. So with that, I'll close out my presentation. I got exactly 3 minutes, I think, for any questions. So thank you very much.
We're done at 1:10, so.
Oh, we've done it 1:10. I have no time left for questions.
Oh, if you can stick around, that's fine. Let's give my hand.
All right, thank you very much. Thanks to all folks online. I know there's a bunch of folks that weren't able to make it in person. Thank you for being here. Email me c-hall at tamu.edu. And you can have your own copy of the PowerPoint. You got a question, you can follow up, and I'll be happy to answer.
A quick one, what's black powder?
Oh, black powder is the equity capital that's brought by venture capitalists. They refer to that as black powder.
Is it explosive or what?
Well, no, it's money, right? So it is explosive, meaning that if they inject, if all of a sudden you have $1 million of equity coming to your business,
Yeah.
then you can grow your business faster than you would if you didn't have that $1 million. So that black powder ignites and it's explosive growth. So that's one of the ways in which you can grow is to invest using equity dollars from a venture capitalist and grow your business faster than you could otherwise. But when times go down, that's when those folks who may be over leveraged and owe that venture capitalist 35% return, that's where they may run out of working capital and then have to go out of business. It's like Carolina Nurseries, a lot of equity capital in the bank at the same time. They were wanting their debt capital in form of interest, couldn't pay it. So Carolina Nurseries went out. Anyway, yes.
Do you have granular data so you could look at, say, plant sales at garden centers in states and relate that to policies around COVID? So I think it'd be really interesting to see how, because you have 50 different experiments, right? And then you've got plant sales are pretty local. So it'd be interesting to see how policy might have affected this.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I do have retail data as part of my national benchmarking program. But it's privatized. You have to pay a subscription for access to that data. But the short answer is that depending on the region of the country, they're not all created equal. And certain regions had greater growth and greater demand than other regions did. And obviously garden centers in that region, those regions did better. In fact, it ranged from 8% this year up to 36% in terms of their gross margin dollars.
But would that be related to, say, percent vaccinated people or something like that?
Oh, in fact, you could even tie it to red counties and blue counties.
Yeah, okay, or something like that, right?
Yeah. There's a correlation there. Is that causation? I'll leave that for the individual to
So
make
blue
that
counties are
determination.
higher?
But blue counties outperform red counties because of the difference in vaccination levels. Yeah, it's kind of interesting how that data parses out like that. Yes, sir.
Do you have any sense of how these trends relate to carbon footprint and sustainability?
Yes, I do. I and Dwayne Ingram at University of Kentucky, we did several life cycle analyses of nursery and greenhouse products. And so we know what that carbon footprint is. Now, the influence of COVID on that carbon footprint, is that what you're asking about?
I'm just wondering what the shape of, say, that the sustainability curve might be in relation to this line that you have here. We're talking about carrying capacity for the basic input resources.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have an answer that I would defend right off the top of my head, but I would like an opportunity to think through that one before I gave you an answer.
Good
In other words, I don't know. So that's a good question though. Now, I think I was on a panel for the International Horticulture Producers about 2 weeks ago. Now, the Dutch and in the UK, they're much further along in answering that question than we are. It's a question of data, and we don't have the data in which to make that correlation. But what they have seen is that there's a strong correlation right now with the movement of the higher demand and the higher demand for sustainably produced lawn and garden products too, plants. I don't know if I answer your question directly, but that's the best I can do right now.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, any last questions?
Otra preguntas, por favor.
You're doing, you clean it up. Okay, let's thank Dr.
All right, thank y'all very much.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.